But I think two things. And if there are any philanthropists listening, my message would be to them. One is we cannot afford to not be helping now, be thinking about the long term immediately, and sort of medium term and long term immediately. The reason being is that the needs are so massive and so urgent, and waiting to make those plans will be far too late for too many people inside Gaza.
Hey, welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on this series, we have Maysa Jalbout, who is an internationally recognized leader in the world of education and philanthropy, and has really been at the center of that world for a few decades. I first came across her work because of her podcast, The Impact Room, and being a fan of many of the organizations that she has run. So it's an honor to have Maysa on. Maysa, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Equally, I'm a big fan of afikra, and so happy to be with you today.
Okay. I want to talk about the world of philanthropy and education, but maybe a really basic question. What are the limits of philanthropy? What can philanthropy do to fix the world's problems? And where is the ceiling? Where does it fall short? Where will it never be able to access?
That's a really good question, and not such a basic one because it's challenging to answer, actually. So the world of philanthropy is quite limited in how it can solve problems. It can really only work effectively when it works in partnership with other key stakeholders, namely government, civil society, and the private sector. So it's one of the important pillars in solving problems, but it can never really work alone. So one of its limitations is when it does attempt to solve a problem without working in partnership. No matter how much philanthropy invests in solving problems, it will never be able to invest more than what government invests in real dollars. And it will never be able to replace the necessary systems that government need to have in place in order to solve those problems. Equally, it needs civil society. Civil society is effectively, and most often, including here in the MENA region, is the engine for delivery. It is what helps deliver on a philanthropic agenda.
Yeah. If you were to try to explain to a 15-year-old what that long word means, what would you describe? How would you define philanthropy to a teenager?
Philanthropy in its most basic form is giving. It's the act of giving money, time, to a particular cause or an issue. I think philanthropy is so inherent in our societies, particularly in our region, that, it's so, to understand it is to understand sort of the fact that, your grandparents, your community, they're all philanthropists and have been so for, all of their lives. It's the way we grow up. And oftentimes the most generous philanthropists are those who are in your community, the people who give day in, day out for a long period of time, are not asking for anything in return. They're not the ones that appear in newspapers or get to talk at big conferences. Usually it's, our mothers and our aunts and our grandmas who come together to help communities. That's what philanthropy really is at its very core.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm in Beirut, and charity and philanthropy they have a mixed reputation in Lebanon, right? The world of philanthropy and charity have a mixed reputation, and in many ways have earned that mixed reputation, right? On one side, you go to a restaurant like Beit Ken's and you hear about Beit al-Baraka and you think, wow, thank God that there are organizations that are cleaning up the streets and trying to, deal with the homeless. But on the other side, you see corruption scandals and, really, really awful abuses of power in that world. And so you see this like mixed messaging. I'm curious, from the inside, do you feel like people fundamentally misunderstand what philanthropists are trying to do? And, where is the gap from public understanding of the philanthropic sector compared to the reality of the philanthropic sector?
Well, I think much of what people are worried about in philanthropy is the overreach or the potential power of philanthropists versus the people who are impacted most closely on the issues that they're trying to solve.
Yeah.
And questioning why a particular philanthropist gets to decide what's good for them, or questioning the reason as to why that philanthropist is engaged in the first place. So I think that power dynamic is often kind of at the root of the mistrust that exists, not just in our region or in Beirut, as you just mentioned, but I think on a global basis, right? I mean, you hear that in reference to some of the largest philanthropists in the world. And so it's interesting because at the same time as we're starting to hear a lot more people question the role of philanthropy and who are the philanthropists and what they get to decide and not decide, we're also starting to see a change in how philanthropy is delivered, because who the philanthropists are is also starting to change. Globally, and for a very long time, the kind of institutionalized philanthropic entities have largely been led by men from Western societies, and they were working in a particular approach, where they employ Western institutions or people in the West to deliver philanthropy kind of in the South. That model is changing quite a lot because we're starting to see many more philanthropists from all parts of the world as wealth increases in many parts of the world, from Africa to Asia to the Middle East. We're starting to see a lot more institutionalization, and with that, an increase in accountability. We're starting to see more women and younger people come into play, and we're starting to see philanthropy evolve completely in that the approach that's used is much closer to home. So you've got a lot more partnership and localization. And we're starting to see also people shift away from pure charitable giving to strategic philanthropy and impact investment. And that's really changing the conversation and changing the way that people engage with it. We're not in let's say, a clear zone where everything is fantastic. It's still an evolution, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but it is changing.
What's the difference between charity and strategic philanthropy? What's a working definition that can help me understand the difference?
Yeah, so charity is still incredibly important. It's what we all know to be, feeding someone who's hungry in Ramadan, or sponsoring a campaign for orphans, or it's the act of giving for no return to a cause that is generally accepted to be as a charitable cause. The strategic philanthropy is much more focused, and the idea is that it's intending to solve for a larger problem. So it's a step or two removed from charitable giving, and it's a bit more long-term, and perhaps sometimes also trying to reach scale.
So it's interesting because like I'm curious about this. I'm curious about some of the major problems in the Arab world that have kind of been persistent and sticky and hard to really unlock. And I'm curious how very smart people who have their interests aligned, their incentives aligned, and who have their hearts and minds in the right place, how they are trying to unlock this. So you've spent a lot of time thinking about education at scale. Let's start with education. Let's start with sort of primary and secondary school education. And even if you want to talk about trade school and career prep, we can talk about that too. But let's talk about some of the stickiest problems in that world that the smartest people in the room are trying to figure out how to unlock at scale. Pick any country you want in the region as a case study, and let's sort of start there.
It's super challenging what you're asking me to do, because one of the challenges that philanthropists in our region are facing is this constant conundrum of wanting to work on long-term issues, and consistently being asked to support short-term challenges. And that's largely because our region is often hit by crises, and there are massive needs in the short term. And we're seeing that live today with what's happening in Gaza, where philanthropists are, very much compelled to help save lives. They're delivering support for food, for healthcare. And some are also starting to look at education, although that's even supporting education. Sometimes it's a hard sell when people are, concerned about how do you save lives? How do you help people, with surgeries? How do you get food to people where they need it? And Gaza is a crisis at a scale that we haven't seen in the region in a long time, but it's not the only crisis, of course. We've got the Syrian refugee crisis only a few years ago. Before that, Iraq, Sudan, Yemen. There's so many countries that are embroiled in crises that oftentimes philanthropists are compelled to work on that. What is interesting is that some of those philanthropists that are working on more strategic and longer term issues can sometimes straddle the immediate and the long term by looking at issues from their root cause and how do you solve for them, but not doing it on their own. I think it's super challenging when philanthropists work on their own, because the magnitude and the scale of some of these challenges that you just are referencing are too much for any one philanthropist to work on, right? So what really works effectively is when a philanthropist says, I'm interested in working on this issue. I want to learn about it. I want to work with civil society, with government. I'm opening the door to collaborate with other philanthropists as well. They may be within the region or globally. And I want to take a lot more long-term, view of that issue. So we've got some interesting case studies. We've got like Community Jameel with Mohammed Abdulatif Jameel, who's been working both in Saudi Arabia, but also globally. And
MIT, all over the world.
Investing in the Jameel Poverty Lab research, which is not an area that we see a philanthropist in the region invest in very often. And that's critical. That's really important, because it's looking at, how do you solve for poverty at the root of it? I think we need to see some of those investments also come to the region. But I think in terms of what's happening what they're doing on a global scale is really quite phenomenal and has had impact very, very broadly. We see also the Jafanis, with their health, the Shifa Fund, and the work that they're doing on immunizations, both in the region, setting up that fund. Gates Foundation is partnering with them, and they're doing really important work in the region and around the region in places like Pakistan, for example. And those cases are really super important.
Yeah.
And we'd hope to see them really flourish and become bigger and have other philanthropists work in the same way, work together on that. Unfortunately, on the side of education, where I'm very deeply involved, I'm not seeing any long-term work, and I'm not seeing any pooled funding happen. Not of yet, but I'm hopeful that will come around.
Yeah. So let's talk about the pooled funding for a second. Let's say you're on the receiving end of funds, right? So you are in a position, let's say you're in a position where you're running some international foundation that's focused primarily on education, which you have done in the past. So this is not a hard thing for you to imagine, right? And you are speaking to a group of the world's biggest philanthropists, and they all have your ear. You have all of their ears. And you're saying, listen, these are the biggest structural problems with international development that no one is benefiting from them. It's not that any single person is benefiting from, they are simply inefficiencies, pure inefficiencies. And if we just somehow did X, Y, and Z, it would only lead to better results for everyone. What are the biggest things that you just wish we could, what inefficiencies do you wish we could just unlock if everyone just sort of did the choreography together?
Oh my goodness. There are too many for us to discuss today.
How long do we have?
Let me just pick one that I think is really, really imminent. And that is investing in local organizations, ensuring that local organizations and those who are most affected are actually leading the solutions that are being invested in. And that's whether it's aid coming from governments or money coming from philanthropic entities or even private sector organizations. One of the most critical challenges is that we have a power imbalance when it comes to money flowing into the countries that are least developed, the highest poverty rates. And even when philanthropists come from that country or from that region, we're not seeing them invest in local organizations. I'll give you an example. There was a report that came out not too long ago, last year, that looked at how African philanthropists invest in the region. And it showed that the vast majority of philanthropic entities that are coming out of Africa are investing in non-African institutions to the tune of like 90%.
What?
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, we don't have a study for the Middle East, but it wouldn't be far off. The vast majority of philanthropic entities still choose to invest through international organizations over local organizations.
Is this just like colonization of the mind? It can't be that simple. Like, what is, everybody wants to wear foreign brands? Is that the idea?
I think there's a little bit of that, yes. I think that there is a little bit of the mindset that they might know better But I also think, to be fair, it's because philanthropists and aid agencies are worried about things like capacity, accountability, money flows, and thinking about efficiencies. So it is true that, for example, if you look at our region here, that we don't have large non-governmental organizations that are working at the scale that, for example, if a very large international philanthropic entity wanted to make a very big investment, would feel quite comfortable in delivering that. And also, depends on the location of those entities. Lebanon is a country that has really great non-governmental organizations. I've done a lot of work with civil society organizations in Lebanon out of need. They're extremely effective, but they are small. And the fact that they are based in Lebanon makes a lot of international organizations worry about sending money directly to Lebanon. So they'll choose to send it to an international organization, which in turn may or may not partner with a local entity. And if they do, they will, in all likeliness, give a very small portion of that funding to that local organization, which leaves the majority of that funding to be, to go to bringing staff in internationally, paying global salaries, investing in systems outside of the region. And so this vicious cycle of then we never invest in the capacity of our own organizations, our own leadership, our own systems. And when crises hit it, or when philanthropists really do want to invest in issues in the region, then they are more likely to look to international organizations, American and European organizations that may have boots on the ground and could be effective, but it will never replace, and in the long term will never be as good as us investing in our own organizations.
Okay, this strikes a nerve with me very
I can
for obvious reasons. This strikes a nerve with me for obvious reasons because I can't imagine. I can't.
By the way, Mikey,
I'm sure. No,
it's a big issue, and I speak to so many organizations in the region that keep asking, how do I get money from philanthropist X or philanthropist Y, and why are they giving money to an international organization? And bless them, a lot of them are doing so much to try to convince organizations to give them money. And some of them sometimes get money from international organizations before they do regional ones. And we can talk. Yeah.
No, of course. That is very, very, very common and infuriating, completely infuriating. And I hope at some point we learn that we've already been taught to fish. We can fish ourselves. We do not need to be given fish. We do not need to be taught to fish. We can support each other and we'll be fine. There's another thing I want to get your take on. And full disclosure, we haven't talked about that. So the next topic before. So if we disagree, I fully welcome it. I'm curious. Let's say somebody comes to you and said they want to start some initiative, okay? And they're interested in it being a social enterprise, but they looked at every single, grant proposal, and it always requires that it is a nonprofit. Would you encourage them to make it a nonprofit, even though, by and large, most nonprofits are completely unsustainable? They don't have business models. They don't have revenue models. Or would you say, no, eventually the development world will come around and they will start to support social enterprises the same way that they support nonprofits?
Well, it's interesting that you asked me that question. I serve on the board of Fanad Venture Philanthropy, which is pretty much the only philanthropic entity in our region that's investing in social enterprises. Its mandate really is to grow that sector in the region. because we very much believe in that is the way of the future. This is how we're going to make this work more sustainable. And also because we see a lot of innovations come from that sector. A lot of young people from this region would prefer to adopt the social enterprise model than to work in a non-profit organization. Look, I think I sit in a world where I believe both are needed, and there are causes and issues that absolutely need to be supported through nonprofit entities. And those organizations can adopt some models, some projects that have return, and that's great. But I think there are some issues that lend themselves better to social enterprise models. But I would never advise someone who is intending or has a solution that can be run through a social enterprise model to switch to a nonprofit to appease a donor. I think that would be absolutely insane. And also I would question, the potential of that partnership with that particular donor. And look, I think sometimes it's attractive because they're looking at aid funding, right? And aid agencies are more likely to fund nonprofit entities, and they see these big dollars and it's attractive. But at the end of the day, that grant will end and you're not further ahead. But the nice thing is that we're starting to see that many private sector organizations, including philanthropists, interested in supporting social enterprises, interested in impact investment, and we're starting to see some success stories. So I would say for anybody who's kind of on the fence or questioning the value of sustaining a social enterprise, hang tight and contact El Sanad.
Yeah, absolutely. I El Fanat. There was a study that came out in the last 6 months, since October 7th, that highlighted the fact that literacy rates in Gaza are among the highest in the region, despite the enormous amounts of challenges that existed under the siege and the insane occupation, the violence of that occupation, the lack of funding, all these different things. As a former high school teacher who taught in a very low-income community in the U.S., economic disadvantage and literacy rates are very inversely correlated. And tons of education advocates in the States and worldwide say we need more investment because literacy is the biggest determinant of economic achievement and the success of somebody's career. What is going on in Gaza such that a place that is so economically and politically disadvantaged before October 7th, before the horror of this genocide, that they were able to achieve these spectacular educational outcomes? What is happening in schools in Gaza where this was even possible?
Well, I think to understand why that is, why education has been the way it has been in Gaza, you have to look at, why education or how education has been treated by Palestinians for the past 75 years. It's not just in Gaza, it's right across with Palestinians in the diaspora. I think it's been so ingrained in every single Palestinian, particularly those that have been uprooted, that the only way out of the challenges that they face as a people who have been uprooted and that face this constant horror of an occupation and violence and being disadvantaged wherever they may live, is to hold on to an education. It's, even in my own family, my grandmother would always say it's the only thing that they can't take away from us as Palestinians. And when people were displaced from their homes in 1948, and shortly after UNRWA, which is today, its existence is in a real threat. It was formed to deliver social benefits for Palestinians, and among them, education. And that helped ensure that education was, delivered to populations, even those who were not able to integrate into national systems. So my mother went to an UNRWA school. And back when UNRWA schools were just tents in Lebanon. And if the UNRWA didn't exist and wasn't delivering education, my mother wouldn't have had access to education because she wasn't allowed to go to public schools in Lebanon. And that's a similar situation across the board. So I think it's been historically very significant and continues today because it's seen as so critical to being able to survive and to turn your life around. But Maki, I should say that education is not important only to Palestinians. It's important to every single refugee population I've worked with around the world. I've met, families, mothers tell me it's more important to them, to the future of their family, to the future of their children, than anything else, than food, than money. They would prioritize education of their children over them having a full stomach because they understand so critically how important that is for them to get out of the dead end that they're under. And I think if you bring that back to Gaza and think about the fact that, Gaza was under a siege for a very long time, over 17 years before October 7th. And I think the population there felt that there's no way out except through education. And it's amazing whether it's like they've adopted online education, the number of students that get scholarships every year, they're hungry for it. And only a few days ago, I met with some university students whose education has been disrupted from Gaza. And I asked them, given what they've just been through and the horrors that their family, their communities are living through, would they now today want to resume their education? Would they have the willpower? Would they have the energy to invest in continuing with their education? And it was a resounding yes. There was not even a moment of hesitation. All of them said unequivocally, we have no choice. We need to continue our education.
Yeah, I mean, it's startling. I mean, definitely that's true of every even the families. I mean, I was working with in New Orleans when I was teaching there, but there is the effort and the input and the will and all that stuff. But to see the results as staggering as that is really, really insanely remarkable and heartwarming and like very, very emotional.
Yeah, and especially that, learning poverty after COVID is actually increasing. The World Bank, the latest figures show that learning poverty in low and middle income countries is sitting somewhere at 70%. Learning poverty means that at the end of primary school, a child is not able to read and understand a simple text. So just think about that for a second. The learning poverty is huge. It's one of our biggest problems in education globally.
So you're not saying, sorry, Maysa, I just want to make sure that people understand. You're not saying that at the end of primary school, people are not at grade level. You're saying they are not capable of comprehending simple text, just basic literacy.
That's what it means, yeah. They're not able to perform a simple function, which is to understand the text, a simple text.
Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off though.
No, not at all. I mean, I was just giving you that figure to juxtapose what you were just saying in terms of literacy rates and commitment to education in Gaza.
Okay, I want to talk also a little more, move away from education for a second. And for context, we are recording this on May 3rd. I should have said that in the beginning, just because we're talking about Gaza and things have been changing day to day. So
there's a lot to say about education in Gaza, by the way. Like, obviously, we tout the amazing number, the high literacy rate, the commitment to education, but we cannot kind of continue the conversation without reminding everyone that's watching that there are no open schools in Gaza. There are no universities left in Gaza. There are 625,000 students who today have no access to education. So it doesn't matter what performance was like before October 7th. Today, we're looking at a situation where the education system has been completely destroyed and we have to build it from scratch. And we owe it to those children and those families that you just mentioned are so incredibly committed to education to ensure that that happens so that education does not fall by the wayside when plans for reconstruction begin.
I want to talk about that reconstruction.
Yeah.
I saw you had posted about this World Bank report a few weeks ago. You posted about this in April. That the estimate of rebuilding the infrastructure, or let me quote this properly, the cost of damage to Gaza's infrastructure is 18.5 billion. So I'd love to understand, obviously you didn't write this report, but as a reader and as somebody who's in this space, what is the international development community responsibility, and what do you think their reaction is to estimates like that and reports like that?
First, Mike, I should say that that number is increasing daily. Just yesterday, I read another figure that is actually significantly higher. It was estimated at the cost of reconstruction would be closer to 40 billion. I think that's partly because the damage is increasing every day. And also the cost of reconstruction will be, higher than the damage that's done. What is the international community doing, or how has this response been? I mean, I think when I judge what's happening in the sector that I work most closely in, both in education and also philanthropic entities, I would say that it has been far too slow to respond. If you think about other crises, whether it's Ukraine or other countries where there have been horrific damage caused, we saw a much more responsive, much quicker, much more open response to supporting people who are facing the kinds of horrors that the people of Gaza are facing. So it's been far too slow, in my opinion. I speak to a lot of philanthropists and a lot of organizations who want to do something but are hesitant. And first, they're hesitant because I think they think they can't do anything until the bloodshed ends and that we reach a sort of a ceasefire, and it's possible to start thinking about more longer term issues other than literally keeping people safe and feeding them. That's a big reason that people are sort of in a holding pattern. But I also think that, people are a little bit more reluctant to work in our region and to work in Gaza for a variety of different reasons. If an organization hasn't worked there before, and they happen to be in the West and they don't know who to partner with, they're going to be more reluctant to do so at this time. The part of the issue as well, I think, is that people are kind of waiting to see what happens. They're not trusting that things will kind of go back to where they are, and we could look at kind of a pure reconstruction plan. People are really quite worried. But I think two things, and if there are any philanthropists listening, my message would be to them. One is, we cannot afford to not be helping now, be thinking about the long term immediately, and sort of medium term and long term immediately. The reason being is that the needs are so massive and so urgent, and waiting to make those plans will be far too late for too many people inside Gaza. So for anybody who's interested in helping now, whether it's in education or health or any other sector, there are plenty of national and regional organizations that are able to help. And I, for one, have offered to shed light on those organizations and to support discussions in that space. Many, as we spoke earlier, many small organizations are able to step up, to support. And of course, many of them work in partnership with international organizations. So there's no excuse not to be able to help in the short term. So if you take a thorny issue like education, because a lot of people are saying, well, education is a longer term issue. Well, it's not. There are thousands of young people who are stuck outside of Gaza at the moment, whose education has come to a complete halt because they're unable to pay for their education, and they need assistance with their tuition fees and the cost of living. Sometimes they're on scholarship, but their parents can't send them money now, and they need a little bit of money to actually survive. And I think that's an easy reach for a lot of philanthropists, particularly as they are outside of Gaza. When you look at also the fact that there's so many incredibly bright young people in high school and in university that could be now going into high schools and universities elsewhere. And yet the response from universities has been absolutely disappointing. And that's a very nice way of putting it. We have not seen that massive outpouring that we saw when so many other crises happened, where they offered immediately scholarships to students from certain nationalities. We have not seen that when it comes to students from Gaza, and that's a real shame. So definitely, philanthropists can leverage their relationships with universities globally to open access to students from Gaza. And I can go on, but I think that in every sector we can talk about examples of how philanthropists could be working in the short term. And in the long term, it takes a long time to plan and to organize. And in most other crises, and I've worked on many, the NGO community should be coming with the UN agencies, with the philanthropists immediately to start making plans. Of course, in partnership with organizations and with thought leaders from Gaza and in the region as well. They cannot be forgotten.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the universities, because one of the pillars of, or one of the things that's getting a lot of screen time and taking up a lot of people's mental space is a discussion around BDS, right? Boycott, divest, sanction, which is this idea. Like yesterday, I was out at out for dinner, and somebody said, "I want to order, Coca-Cola," and then the restaurant said, "We don't sell that anymore." And I'm wondering if there's a similar conversation happening in the international development world as well, where local NGOs are saying, we will not accept money from specific places anymore. It's part of a system that is perpetuating our condition, and whether it's even morally correct, it's not strategically correct. We're not going to do that anymore. As somebody who's plugged in from so many different sides, do you hear that conversation coming up more and more locally? Organizations saying, we will not accept money from certain actors, even if they are supporting our schools and supporting our healthcare clinics, we're not accepting the money.
Yes, I am hearing this now, and I have to say that it's surprising, but it's indicative of kind of chasm, the kind of gap that we're starting to see between this part of the world and the West in particular. And I'm really worried about that. I talk to a lot of people in the sector, and even young people, who are working in the private sector, who are educated abroad, who are really questioning their relationship with Western institutions in particular at this time. And we can get into that a bit if you want, but I think there's a this mistrust that's setting in, and kind of after October 7th in particular, there's almost like a disillusionment with how and if Western institutions value the lives of people in this part of the world, and if the values and the kind of policies that have been espoused for so long actually apply to this part of the world. And with that, of course, that conversation has been carried into nonprofit entities and others who are questioning where the money is coming from. But I think not just where the money is coming from, but what are the conditions that are put on those dollars, and how they have to spend them. I think a lot of organizations are now having honest conversations about, and it ties into that sort of decolonization and localization conversation that we just spoke about. It's demanding that they are heard and they are understood, and that they have a very strong say in how money is invested, and who is leading that conversation. So yes, it is happening. I'm not necessarily seeing a full out BDS being carried out in the nonprofit sector, but certainly what is happening is that we're starting to see more regional actors have conversations around, the role of regional philanthropists, for example, filling in that gap. If organizations in the region are going to step away from funding that they feel ties them to an entity that they don't necessarily buy into all of their values, or may put restrictions on them, then funding needs to come from elsewhere. And so there are conversations being had in that space. Probably not enough, Mikey, at this point, but I see it heading in that direction, and I see more and more, particularly of these conversations happening, and not just in our region. I think globally as well.
It's interesting because, like, the transaction it's not always clear who, and I'm going to use crude language to try to emphasize a point. It's not always clear who was the client and who was the provider of the service, right? When it comes to philanthropy. Like let's say some nonprofit in Lebanon who's providing, meals in, let's say, in a refugee community, right? It's like a soup kitchen. They apply for funds from the U.S. State Department, or they apply for funds from USAID, or they apply from... At first glance, it looks like, okay, USAID is giving them a service, right? They are providing them funds, and they're the recipient of that service. And so in that case, BDS doesn't really apply. But sometimes I wonder if it's really flipped, if they are actually providing a service to the philanthropist, right? And in this case, they are, the philanthropist has a mission. They want to, they want to support aid. And this local actor is doing that work for them, right? They are actually implementing the work. It's part of the organization's agenda and mission, and everyone has a right to have their own agenda. But in that case, when you sort of flip the script and you understand, oh, you're actually doing a service for them. You are doing the service for them. And then in that case, if that's the case, then the BDS sort of framework should have some sort of relevance in that case, right? You should really understand, who do you really want to be providing services to? Does that make sense? Do I have it flipped? Does that make any sense?
No, I mean, you're touching on a much bigger issue around, who frames the issues, who supplies the resources, who's in charge of making decisions that impact people's lives most closely, and do these small organizations that are surviving on meager amounts of funding from international organizations have the privilege to say no? And if they don't take that money from that international organization, where do they get the money from? And and I think it's not sort of clear cut. And I think many organizations would rather, for example, take the money from a crowdfunding source, so that they don't have one big donor that tells them what to do, dictates to them what to do. Or they would really like to get funding from a new type of philanthropist, like a McKinsey Scott, who's a blank check, no strings attached. Just, go on with what you're trying to do. And in some cases, few, not many, as we discussed before, don't want philanthropic dollars. They really just want a viable economic model that helps them, run their service directly to the people. And in Lebanon, it's been a real innovator in this space. We can talk about some examples. We're starting to see, social enterprises that deliver a service to people who need it at a cost that people can afford to pay for it without taking philanthropic dollars. It's amazing. It's revolutionary. And
yeah, I mean, I will die on this hill. Afikra is a social enterprise, and I wouldn't change it. And I think more organizations should really think about this model, and really should start thinking of themselves as service providers.
Yeah.
Instead of recipients.
But I also think, just to close off on this conversation, I think that there is a space, and it's very active right now, where organizations from this region, certainly it's happening in Africa and Asia, when you have a voice, that you could use it to actually force a change in the way that aid and philanthropy are delivered. And I've interviewed some of those organizations on my podcast, organizations like Pratham and Bra, where they are actually changing the paradigm of how funding is delivered to them by really centering their model. And philanthropic entities and aid agencies then are coming to them to actually deliver their agenda versus the other way around. And so it's not a one-way track. There's a lot of work that we can do also to change the dynamic.
Amazing. Maysa, before we close up, I want to just give you an opportunity to make recommendations.
Right.
So whether they are books, podcasts, I'm going to plug your own podcast, The Impact Room, but books, podcasts, organizations, websites that people should check out if they're interested in international development, philanthropy, education, sort of the future of the region. You're super plugged in. So if you have any ideas, and if there are some that you can't remember, we'll turn this into a blog post and put it up on the website too.
Yeah, in fact, I have too many probably to just rattle off. So maybe I will just do that and send in some recommendations in for both books and a podcast. I did, if you don't mind, want to round off with some recommendations to philanthropists. And similarly, also to organizations that are seeking funding from philanthropy, four pieces of kind of advice, if you will. And I am directing this to philanthropic entities in our region, but the same applies to around the world. I think we need to see much more evidence-based philanthropic investment. Too many philanthropists still invest because they know someone, or they're interested in an issue, or they want to see something delivered by hand. We need evidence-based philanthropy, there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of just ensuring that organizations that receive funding are also able to show how they have impact. And this is, on both sides. The second point, I wrote them down here so I won't forget what I wanted to tell you, is that, there's so much overlap in the way that philanthropic entities work, that we are seeing some really big gaps in the way that philanthropy is unfolding in the region. And what we really need to see is, especially those larger philanthropic entities, really focus on some of the key gaps and delve deep so that they can make a difference, they can innovate, and they can attract others, as opposed to, continuing to just take little bites, here and there, and not really tackle anything head on. We need those kind of courageous philanthropic moves. We talked a lot about working in partnership and investing in local and regional organizations. Can't emphasize that enough. And then the fourth point is pooling resources. No one philanthropic entity can solve all these problems on their own. We need to work together. We need to make sure that a substantial amount of resources goes into any one of these challenges that we're facing. So pooling resources is essential.
Amazing. Maysa, thanks so much. This was so enlightening. I appreciate it. People can find you online. I highly recommend checking out the podcast. You can find anywhere podcasts are found, The Impact Room. Maysa, thanks so much.
Thanks so much for having me.